January 14th, 1944, northern France. At dawn, 30 Messerschmitt Bf-109s prepared to take off from a frozen airstrip near Cambrai. Their target, American bombers heading for the Ruhr. Their confidence, absolute. But one aircraft didn't lift off. Then another. Engines coughed, sputtered, and one exploded on the runway. By noon, half the squadron was gone, not to enemy fire, but to a single wrench turned the wrong way by a tired mechanic. Before we begin this story of a single mistake that cost an entire squadron, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy uncovering the untold stories of World War II. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see how far these forgotten moments still travel. Now let us begin. Chapter 1. The Winter Hangar Routine. Before disaster. January 1944. Northern France was locked in ice. The Luftwaffe airfield at Cambrai smelled of fuel, frost, and fear. Inside Hangar 2, mechanics worked in silence under a pale light that flickered with each gust of wind. They were ghosts in gray overalls, their breath turning to mist as they wrestled with metal colder than bone. Every sound wrench on steel, valve hissing, boots scraping on frozen floor, echoed like a clock counting down. Among them was Gefreiter Otto Ziegler, 23 years old, thin as a wire, with grease-stained fingers that never stopped shaking. He wasn't afraid of war. He was afraid of making a mistake. Ziegler had been assigned to JG-54 Grünherz, a Messerschmitt squadron, fighting the endless war of attrition in the skies over Europe. They called it the Green Hearts, though by 1944, there wasn't much heart left in them. Fuel was scarce, pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced, and maintenance crews worked 20 hours a day just to keep the aircraft in the air. The night before, a new order had come from headquarters. All aircraft must be ready for a dawn scramble. Enemy bombers were expected over the Ruhr, and every fighter, every single one, had to fly. That meant no sleep, no second checks, just work. The Messerschmitt Bf-109F-4s lined the runway like statues, frost collecting along their wings. Inside the hangar, Ziegler crouched beneath one of them, his hands deep inside the engine bay. The DB601 engine was a masterpiece of precision, 12 cylinders, direct fuel injection, built for speed and altitude. But it was also fragile. If the fuel mixture ran too lean, it would seize. Too rich, and it would choke. He'd done this job hundreds of times, checking pressure lines, tightening clamps, setting mixture valves. But this morning, his tools felt heavier. His mind blurred from exhaustion. He'd been awake for 40 hours. The line chief shouted, "Hurry it up, Ziegler. Command wants the birds in the air by 0700. He nodded, tightening a nut on the fuel pump with trembling hands. He didn't. He noticed the small torque wrench on the floor had frozen stiff, its calibration off by a fraction. He didn't notice the line he'd just reattached was reversed the feed and return switched by mistake. A detail no one else would see once the cowling closed. At 0635, engines began roaring to life across the airfield. The smell of gasoline mixed with the icy air. Pilots strapped in, ground crews saluted, and one by one, the fighters taxied toward the runway, their propellers carving halos of frost. Ziegler wiped his hands on a rag and stepped back, heart pounding. For a moment, he felt pride. They were ready. He was ready. And for just a second, he forgot how tired he was. The first Bf-109 lifted off perfectly, then another. Then, from the far end of the line, one engine sputtered, coughed, caught flame. A mechanic screamed. The sound ripped through the hangar like a blade. Ziegler turned just in time to see the second fighter lurch sideways, smoke billowing from the exhaust ports. The pilot throttled back, too late. The engine seized mid-rotation. A second explosion followed. Metal fragments tore through the morning fog. Within minutes, the scramble turned into chaos. Engines shut down. Fire crews ran. 3 aircraft burned before they ever left the ground, and Otto Ziegler stood frozen in the snow, his wrench still warm in his hand, watching his mistake consume everything he'd tried to keep alive. Chapter 2. The Fault Line. When Steel Betrayed Skill, by R720, the sky over Cambrai was full of black smoke and white breath. The first formation of Bf-109s that had managed to take off circled above the field, waiting for orders to climb toward the bomber route. But something was wrong. Ground crews waved frantically, signaling the lead flight to return. Engines misfired mid-climb, leaving trails of raw fuel in the air, long, uneven streaks that shimmered like oil on water. From the command tent, Major Eric Lentz watched through binoculars, his jaw clenched. "That engine vapor, not contrail," he muttered. "Those injectors are flooding." Within seconds, one Messerschmitt broke formation, then another. One pilot radioed in, his voice cracking through static. "Pressure drop. Fuel line, no response." The radio cut out. A black dot fell toward the tree line, trailing fire. Then silence. Ziegler heard the impact before he saw the smoke. He was still standing beside the hangar, numb from cold and disbelief. When the second aircraft hit, the shockwave rattled the metal walls. Someone shouted his name. "Ziegler, get the tools. We've got to check every line." He ran through every step, felt like running through water. By the time he reached the wreck of the first plane, there was nothing left but a half-buried engine block and scorched snow. The smell of burned fuel filled his lungs. He crawled beneath the twisted fuselage, tracing the remains of the fuel system. The return line, charred but intact, was connected in a reverse. The feed from the pump led to the return valve. Fuel pressure had built up in the closed system until it ignited. His stomach turned. He'd done this repair himself. He remembered the sound of the wrench, the frozen torque, the shouted orders. He remembered thinking, "I'll recheck it later." He never had. By 08-6, the surviving aircraft were ordered to stand down. 7 planes had been destroyed, 3 on the ground, 4 in the air. 12 men dead. None killed by the enemy. Major Lenz stormed across the field, his boots kicking up ash. He grabbed Ziegler by the collar. "What did you do to my aircraft?" Ziegler couldn't answer. He just stared at his hands, the same hands that had built engines, repaired valves, and now, without meaning, had sent 12 men to their deaths. "It's the lines," he whispered. "They were reversed." "You re-saying this was maintenance error?" "Yes, sir, mine." Lentz's expression hardened, not rage, just fatigue. The kind that comes when there's no one left to punish but the war itself. "You'll report to the investigation board," he said quietly. "Until then, you don't speak to anyone." He walked away, leaving Ziegler standing in the gray morning, his shadow long against the scorched snow. That night, he sat alone in the hangar. Outside, the flames from the wreck still smoldered, painting the frost in red and black. He replayed every motion in his head, every turn of the wrench, every flicker of the light bulb above him. The sound of the explosion echoed again and again, until it no longer sounded like a blast, but like breath, a dying engine gasping for air. He didn't cry. He didn't pray. He just stared at his hands until dawn, and when the first light touched the runway, he realized the machines weren't what had betrayed him. It was fatigue. It was obedience. It was war itself. Chapter 3. the flight that never returned. By the next morning, the field at Cambrai was silent. The burnt shells of 7 Messerschmitts sat black against the frost, their wings twisted like dead birds. The official report called it engine malfunction. During takeoff, 3 words that erased 12 names and 1 man's mistake. Otto Ziegler had not slept. He had not been arrested either. The Luftwaffe couldn't afford to lose mechanics, even guilty ones. Instead, they gave him new orders. Transfer to JG3 Saint-Dizier. You were needed there. He packed his tools, his uniform, and his guilt, and rode in the back of a supply truck through the snow-choked countryside. The war had shifted east, but to men like him, it was always the same. Engines, fuel, orders, silence. When he arrived at Saint-Dizier, the base looked identical. The same hangars, the same frost on the windows, the same weary men doing impossible work for a country that was already collapsing. The first officer who greeted him, Lieutenant Arno Kruger, handed him a clipboard. You worked Cambrai, right? Good. We just got their replacement engines. You'll know them. Ziegler froze. He knew them. They were the same DB601s, the same engines he had serviced before the accident. They had been salvaged from the wreckage, refitted, reassigned. The same fault lived inside them unseen, uncorrected, waiting. He opened one of the crates and saw the same layout of lines and valves. Everything looked perfect. That was the danger of perfection. It hid its own flaws too well. He wanted to speak up. He wanted to say, check the feed and return lines. It's wrong. But the last time he had spoken, 12 men had died. Now, silence felt safer. On January 20th, 1944, JG-3 launched a full intercept mission, 20 fighters tasked with stopping an American formation over Reims. Ziegler stood on the runway as the first group took off, the roar of their engines cutting through the cold air like knives. He watched each one disappear into the gray sky, and though he couldn't see the lines under their cowling, he could feel the twist of metal inside them, the error buried in the machine like a seed. At 0910, the radio crackled. Falcon 1 to base, fuel pressure dropping. Say again, pressure 0, engine fire. Static. A second voice screamed, "He is burning! He is gone!" One by one, the calls came in 3, then 5, then 7 aircraft lost in 10 minutes. No enemy contact, no anti-air fire, just engines failing in unison, as if the sky itself had betrayed them. Ziegler dropped his wrench. He didn't wait for orders. He ran to the nearest aircraft still taxiing and waved his arms frantically. Stop! Stop! The pilot cut the throttle and climbed out, confused. Ziegler ripped open the side panel and pointed to the fuel manifold. Even before touching it, he saw it the same reversal, the same mistake. Only this time, he hadn't made it. It had been copied, standardized, approved. Someone at headquarters had seen the original Cambrai report, decided the fault was minor, and duplicated the maintenance procedure across every replacement engine in the region. His error had become doctrine. He sank to his knees in the snow, the world spinning with the smell of fuel and fire. For the rest of that day, the sky over Saint-Dizier burned. And when the smoke cleared, another Luftwaffe squadron was gone, not shot down by the enemy, but by one-man SS silence. That night, Ziegler wrote a report by candlelight. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He just wrote the truth, line by line, and at the bottom, under the column marked cause, he signed his name. Mechanic S error, repeated through regulation. When he handed it in the next morning, the officer skimmed it, nodded, and said simply, "You did your duty, Gefreiter. That's all that matters now." But it wasn't he, not for him. He'd built engines all his life, and now he knew what they really ran on. Not fuel, not air, but men's mistakes. Chapter 4. The Inquiry, a Wrench, and a Name. The investigation began 3 days later. The smoke had cleared from Saint-Dizier, but the air still smelled of fuel and guilt. A gray tent was erected near the wreckage, its flaps snapping in the cold wind. Inside sat 3 officers, a single typewriter, and a stack of empty forms. Ziegler stood before them, cap in hand, his uniform stiff with oil stains. He had written his confession once already, but the typed version in front of him was not the same. Words had been changed, phrases softened. Where his report said fuel line reversal caused by mechanic, the official version now read possible malfunction in supply manifold under investigation. He looked up from the paper. "Sir, this isn't to what I wrote." The senior officer, Oberst Joachim Brandt, didn't he look up from his pen? "You wrote too much." "But it's the truth." The lines were reversed. "It's your duty," Brandt interrupted, "is to maintain aircraft, not assign blame." The man to his left, a younger lieutenant with sharp cheekbones, smiled faintly. "You think the Führer wants the newspapers to print that the Luftwaffe can defuel its own planes?" Ziegler didn't answer. He just stared at his hands again, the same hands that had written the truth, now being told to forget it. Brandt signed the form with a flourish and slid it across the table. "This is what happened," he said. "A manufacturing defect in the manifold. Write it, repeat it, believe it." Ziegler hesitated. "And the men who died?" "Heroes," Brandt said. "All of them. You want them remembered as victims of a wrench?" The words hit like a hammer. He signed the paper, not because he believed it, but because he knew that in this army, truth had no maintenance schedule. That evening, he returned to the hangar to collect his tools. His locker had already been emptied. Someone had left a single object on the workbench, the same torque wrench he'd used at Cambrai. The handle was cracked, the calibration mark frozen in place. Tied to it was a note. For records, evidence sealed, case closed. He turned the wrench over in his hands. The metal was cold, heavier than he remembered. Every scratch on it felt like a word he'd tried not to say. Outside, snow began to fall soft, slow, indifferent. The sound of hammers and engines echoed faintly from the next hangar, as if the war didn't care that another squadron was gone. He thought about writing again, sending a letter to headquarters, to someone who might still listen. But who was left? The officers lied to protect their ranks. The pilots were dead, and the truth, like the engines, was already buried under paperwork. So he walked out of the hangar for the last time, leaving his wrench on the table. The guard at the gate didn't even ask for his pass. He was invisible now, a man erased by his own precision. A week later, a news report circulated through Luftwaffe command. Maintenance protocols revised for DB601 engines, fuel return systems to be rechecked for pressure imbalance. No one mentioned Cambrai, no one mentioned Saint-Dizier, and certainly no one mentioned Otto Ziegler. But among the ground crews, the story spread anyway, not as gossip, as a warning. They called it Ziegler's ghost, the unseen hand that haunted every engine bay, reminding them that one small twist of metal could end an entire war for someone. Chapter 5. The Burden Guilt in the Shadows of Defeat, Day 1945. Berlin had fallen. Germany was no longer a country, only a shape drawn in ashes. In the ruins of what used to be a rail depot outside Kassel, a single man worked silently under the shell of a dismantled truck engine. His hands were slower now, older, trembling not from age but from memory. The name stitched on his torn jacket, Ziegler, meant nothing anymore. He no longer wore a uniform, but the war still clung to him like the smell of oil and smoke that never washed away. Each turn of a bolt brought back a sound, a radio crackle, a pilot's last words, the roar of engines dying mid-climb. He'd tell himself he was fixing machines again, but in truth, he was trying to fix time. After Germany's surrender, Ziegler was captured by American forces and assigned to a repair camp near Frankfurt. They didn't know who he was, only that he could fix engines faster than anyone else. An American sergeant once asked him, half joking, "You guys built those Tigers, right? Hell of a machine." Ziegler just nodded. He didn't tell him that he'd sabotaged one once not to harm, but to stop the killing. He didn't tell him about the squadrons, or the men whose names he still whispered in his sleep. Some truths were heavier than the steel he worked with. At night, in the barracks, other POWs argued about who was guilty and who was not, who had followed orders and who had enjoyed them. Ziegler never joined. He knew that guilt wasn't something you could argue. It was something you carried like a wrench in your pocket that never left your hand. When he was released in 1947, he walked home through a country that didn't exist anymore. He found his village half burned, his workshop gone. He rebuilt it alone. No sign, no banner, no flag, just a small shed with an oil lamp that burned long after midnight. Neighbors would bring him tractors, motorbikes, anything that still made noise. He fixed them all. Every time an engine came back to life, people thanked him. He just nodded. He didn't hear their gratitude, only the echo of 12 voices that never came back. In the evenings, he'd sit outside with a cigarette, listening to the wind through the trees, and sometimes, in the distance, he swore he could still hear the hum of aircraft engines fading into the clouds. In 1962, a letter arrived from a former Luftwaffe officer, someone who had served under Brandt. Inside was a single sentence. They finally admitted the fault was mechanical. The inquiry was wrong. No apology, no recognition. Just a fact, too late to matter. He folded the paper carefully, placed it inside an old toolbox, and closed the lid. He didn't need forgiveness. He'd stopped believing in that years ago. All he wanted was silence and perhaps one morning to wake up without the smell of fuel in his lungs. When Otto Ziegler died in 1974, the village mechanic was buried with no military honors, no flag, no speeches. But among the locals, there was one story that always followed his name, the man who never stopped fixing things, because somewhere deep down, he still thought he could fix the past. Epilogue. The war ended with grand speeches and signed documents. But for men like Ziegler, it never truly ended. It lived on in their hands, their dreams, and in every broken machine they tried to make whole again. Before you go, take a moment to remember the ones who carried their wars in silence. They weren't generals, or heroes, or traitors. Just men who did their jobs and sometimes paid the price for doing them too well. Stay healthy. Subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you in the next one. And if you have an idea for another untold story, share it in the comments. Your voice helps keep their memory alive.